Okay, good morning, everyone. My name is André. I'm a newly graduated environmental engineer from EPFL, and I'm super honored to have been invited to moderate this session. So I would like to start by thanking the organizer, of course the E4S Center, but especially the Tech for Impact team, because it is so crucial today to bring important topics like this on our campus, EPFL, UNIL, IMD. And so I guess you all came here to this event to learn about sustainability, but what does sustainability even mean? Maybe we should agree on that before. Sustainability is not just about sorting your waste, capturing carbon, or even installing solar panel. It's not even just the SDGs. Sustainability, to face the issues we are facing, should be global and systemic, should be inclusive and interdisciplinary. And living in a sustainable way implies rethinking our relationship to each other, our relationship with nature, and so our economic system. And a lot of people understood it a long time ago. When I first began my journey about sustainability, there was this book everybody talked about, the Meadows Report, also known as The Limits to Growth, commissioned by the Club of Rome in 1972. It is the first piece of work written by system dynamic scientists from the MIT that acted an infinite growth in a finite system is not possible and will lead to the collapse of the system. It was 50 years ago. And this morning, we are super lucky to have one of the co-authors of the report, the Professor Jorgen Randers. Professor Randers is a professor emeritus of climate strategy at the BI Norwegian Business School, full member of the Club of Rome, and one of the most respected voices on the issues of the future, especially related to climate, energy, system dynamics, and sustainability. So please, everybody, welcome Professor Randers.
Good morning. You may notice that I'm well dressed. I have been well dressed for several decades now because I put on the dark suit whenever I'm going to talk about the most important topic of the world, namely the world's future and the sustainability challenge. So please enjoy the dress. I am not insulted by the fact that you are not dressed up, because it's important enough that I am. I'm going to do something which is not doable. I'm going to try to influence your worldview before I start discussing what technology can do in order to change the world. In the process, I'm using a number of slides, time graphs. I use those for two reasons. I show them for those few of you who enjoy time graphs. You will look at them and see, wonderful, very interesting. For the rest of you, don't worry. I'm not talking about the graph. Listen to what I'm saying. The second reason why I show the graphs in the background is to indicate to you that there is very much more sound. Now there is sound. I'm subtracting this from my 40 minutes. I never accept talks that are less than 40 minutes. So please, that's the timer I'm looking at. Wonderful, thank you very much. This is, I've never been able to negotiate on screen, on stage. So the second reason why I'm showing the graphs is to impress you. You know, just to make the point that there is very, very much more substance behind what I'm saying than my very simple, ironic, and unprecise words. And the fastest way to do it is just to show you slides that you don't understand and don't speak about them. So, here, sorry. 50 years ago, my friends and I wrote this book called The Limits to Growth. It was the book that started the still ongoing debate about whether it is possible, to have an unending growth in population, physical resource use, physical emissions of pollutants, physical cutting down of forests on a finite planet. The Limits to Growth did introduce this discussion using, as the moderator said, the first ever global assessment model, a computer model that included both nature and man in one quantitative framework, a dynamic simulation model. And we used the model to produce 12 scenarios for world development from 1970 to the year 2100. 6 of the scenarios were sad scenarios where something went wrong in the 21st century. Either there were too few resources, too much emissions, too little land, too much land erosion, etc. And 6 of the scenarios were of the type where humanity managed to achieve a certain degree of sustainability, meaning well-being that lasted. So we had 6 overshoot and collapse futures, and we had 6 more or less happy solutions. The point was, at the time, that we didn't know enough. Science did not know enough to tell which of these 12 scenarios was the most likely one. So we didn't make a forecast that this and that would happen. What we did do was basically to say, please, mankind, keep away from the overshoot and collapse scenarios and aim for sustainability. Of course, the word sustainability was not invented until 17 years later in the Brundtland Commission. We used the word equilibrium, which people didn't like. What I'm going to do next is to fast forward. So I'm going to answer these questions. What did Limits to Growth say 50 years ago? What has happened since? What will happen during the next 50 years? What should be done? How can this be achieved? What is holding us back? And how can technology help? And as the moderator also has already said, what did Limits to Growth say? It made the totally obvious statement that you cannot have an ever-expanding population on a finite planet, nor can you dig out more resources every year endlessly on a finite planet, nor can you emit pollutants in tons per year at an increasing rate forever when you live on a tiny, small green and blue golf ball hanging in endless black space. This is so trivial that it is not worthy of any type of discussion, and we did not expect there to be any discussion on that issue. But what we did do, we asked the question, so when this physical expansion comes to an end, how will it end? Will it end by the population and the activity level leveling off under global planetary boundaries? Or will it actually, while we discuss the reality of these boundaries, just keep growing into unsustainable territory and then be forced back into sustainable levels, either through catastrophe or through some kind of managed decline organized by humanity? So that was the warning, and we basically said that it is most likely, because of the decision delays in global society, that we will get overshoot followed by unavoidable collapse. And then the third point, which is of relevance to this meeting, we were arguing that technological advance can actually help the situation by practically expanding the size of the planet, but that it doesn't solve the problem. In order to solve the problem, you need institutional innovation or behavioral change or social science. What has happened since? We're now 50 years into the 130-year forecast period or scenario period. And in essence, the world has followed the middle of road of the 12 global scenarios. There has been, which you can see in these graphs, where 4 of the scenarios are in colors and the black line, the dots, is essentially what has happened in the real world. So you see the population has grown more or less like in the limits to growth. The industrial output has grown. That's the production, physical production, more or less like in limits to growth. The fossil reserves, the use of coal, oil, and gas, has depleted available reserves, but not significantly, not enough to call it a collapse. Pollution emissions have increased, just like in limits to growth. And perhaps more interestingly, welfare has been growing. The black line, this is the Human Development Index, superposed on limits calculation of the same thing. And you see a growing increase in the human welfare, as you know, but starting to stagnate. So what is the conclusion? The conclusion is that the world did not actually listen very carefully to the recommendations of the young people who wrote the book. It has just continued expanding during this period, but we're starting to see some effect of the technological and institutional response that has actually taken place during the last 50 years. We have gotten renewable energy, we have gotten ministries of environment, we have gotten international agreements, the IPCC, etc., etc. So things have happened, but not enough to stop the growth in the footprint. The easiest way for you to be convinced quickly that we have actually overshot, is in the climate area. So every year now, humanity, emits into the atmosphere roughly twice as much CO2 and other greenhouse gases as is being absorbed in the world's oceans and in the world's biomass forests during that period. So 1/2 of the CO2 actually goes into the ocean and the biomass, and 1/2 remains in the atmosphere. And as long as this pumping of CO2 into the atmosphere goes on, the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere goes up. And when the concentration is higher than it was in 1850, we get a warmer climate than we got. And so this is just going to happen. We are clearly in unsustainable territory on the climate front. So, yes, we have had overshoot, or we are in overshoot, but we have not collapsed. Because if you look at the historical data, we cannot see steep declines in population, in output, and other things. So, when we want to brag, we say that the limits to growth has been right, at least this far. So that leads to the next and interesting question: what is going to happen during the next 50 years? And that is the research topic of myself and my friends over the last decade. We have written several books on this issue. We are now preparing the 50-year anniversary report of the limits to growth. It will appear in early September, which is a new computer model of the world, much better, and a new analysis of the situation, much richer than the old one. And that's, of course, a story about what is going to happen unless we act, and what could happen if we do act. So this is called Earth for All. That's the title. So Limits to Growth will convert into Earth for All. And Earth for All basically says the following, that unless there is truly extraordinary action, and this means action beyond the decision styles that we have been using over the last 40 years. It's not a rigid status quo, but it is just keeping the political momentum and the technological momentum of the last 40 years into the future. This will, as far as at the summary level, as far as we can see, lead to a slowing in the growth of the footprint, possibly towards a peak in a generation or so. And there will, of course, be institutional response, technological responses to this, but not enough to avoid rising temperatures throughout the period, and not enough to remove the real problem of today, namely the 6.5 billion people who live in the poor world, and particularly the 3 billion that are really poor at this point in time. So this is what the most likely future looks like. We call it too little, too late, to give it a sexy name. This is what we think will happen. And let me talk, for those of you who don't like graphs, let me talk about some of the main variables. The population will continue to grow, reach a peak in the middle of the century, and then start declining. It will not decline because we starve. It will decline because women in rich countries choose to have fewer children. So this is basically a decline which is voluntary and willed because there is more health, education, contraception, and opportunity for women. The GDP, the value of economic production, will continue rising throughout. It will grow at slower rates because rich countries do have slower productivity increase than poor nations. There will be a shift in the emphasis of the structure of the economy from dirty activity to cleaner activity with lower productivity. But in sum, the GDP and hence the disposable income is actually going to continue to rise through the period. And now I start with the more novel parts of the model. Inequality in the model system, the ratio of what the owners make compared to what the workers make, will rise. Inequality will continue to develop in a negative direction as a consequence of continued liberalization and continued capitalism, which has, as a consequence, a rise in inequality. Energy and food use will increase because there are more people and because the people are richer. As a consequence, emissions will rise from agriculture and from energy production. But technology will, of course, evolve during this period, reducing the emissions per unit of consumption to such an extent that emissions most likely will peak within the next, we think before 2040, that the global climate emissions will reach a peak. But that is too late for the temperature. You see the black line, which shows the global warming, which passed 1.1 degrees centigrade roughly at this point in time. You see it passes 2 degrees centigrade in the middle 2050s and peaks around plus 2.5 degrees at the end of the century. So in summary, this is not a pretty picture. it is certainly not for the poor of the world, who will remain, much poorer than desirable. But it is neither very nice for the rich 1.5 billion people because of the inequality and because of the temperature. So in sum, look at the green line. The green line is the well-being, the broader well-being, which actually has been rising over the last 30 to 40 years. We foresee a continuing decline in the general well-being of the average population. These averages are, of course, heroic averages with huge differences between different regions, but it's going down. This will lead the narrow line, the social tension, when there is lack of progress in society, the tensions, the conflicts, the irritation, the frustration will arise and in some places, lead to social collapse. So not environmentally induced collapse, which we don't see essentially on the radar, but social problems being the real killer. So, sad. I've been told by my wife and my colleagues that, you should not be such a doomsday prophet, which you have been for the last 50 years. You must give people hope, and you must smile. So I am now smiling and moving on to what can be done. I mean, can anything be done about this? And the answer, luckily, is yes. So what needs to be done? What needs to be done is essentially to reduce the human footprint as fast as possible. The problem is not in the economic sector. The problem is the footprint. It is measured in tons. It's the emissions, the resource use, the land use, etc. It's the physical impact which is the problem, which need to be reduced as fast as possible. And this, how do? You do this by trying to reduce the footprint per person, so the physical energy use, the physical resource use, etc. And you try to reduce population growth further from what is going on, through the increase of economic stature of women. And of course, if you want to reduce the footprint, the most important part of the world is the rich world. It is, of course, us, the 1.5 billion who live in high productivity countries, which produce much more than half of the footprint. So what the 6.5 billion poor people do doesn't really matter. It is what the 1.5 billion people in the rich world do. And so it's rich babies that are dangerous. It is not poor babies in dusty India. However, if we are going to be able to solve the problem, it must be done in a fair manner. And that means fair as perceived by the 6.5 billion who are not, the rich. And what does this mean? This means that you don't get anywhere in the climate fight or in the whatever, unless you solve the problem of global poverty. You need to do something about particularly the 3 billion who are at the bottom of the economic ladder. And you need to do something about inequality in the rich world in order to be able to get democratic support for those strong actions that are necessary. The latter point is wonderfully illustrated by the yellow vests, the vest jaune in France. Macron, the president, putting in place a perfectly rational policy, namely high fuel prices in order to reduce consumption and to reduce the footprint, and meets a wall of opposition, of course, from the majority of French, because they say, why should I pay the bill? And unless you come up with solutions which place the bill on the rich, you won't get anywhere. I'm reading my manuscript just in order to try to keep within, because it says here all the things I don't have the time to say. So that's why I'm doing this very unprofessional thing of looking at the manuscript. So the next question then is, how can this be achieved? So it's totally obvious what we need to do: reduce the footprint and reduce the population. How can this be done? Well, it must be done in a fair manner. We have spent a lot of time in the ongoing Earth for All project to try to find the smallest number of actions that are unavoidable. The ones that you need to do if you want to create a future where well-being is not declining, but ideally, going up during this century. So we're trying to get the green line, to stop declining over the next decade. And it turns out that we have been able to negotiate this list. So these are the 5 turnarounds needed to reduce the human footprint, to avoid the decline in average well-being. And they're pretty obvious once you see them. And please have an eye at what technology can do under each of these things, both physical technology or normal technology and social technology, institutional change, behavioral change. So the first thing you need to do is to eliminate global poverty. That means trying to reduce the number of really poor people from 3 billion to 0 during the next generation or 2. And the only thing one can say here is that the Western attempts using the Washington Consensus, neoclassical macro, free trade, etc., hasn't done the trick. We have spent a long time providing assistance from the Swiss development aid and the Norwegian development aid, cooperation assistance. It hasn't worked. At the same time, the Chinese have been able to double the income of 1.4 billion Chinese in 40 years. And of course, there are many reasons not to like the Chinese, but at least this gives the reason to think that what we may need are new growth models. And when you start thinking about it, it means you need much more plan, much more strong government, and much less market in order to eliminate global poverty within the next generation or 2. The second thing you need to do, you need to reduce inequality, both in the poor world, but particularly in the rich world, in order to be able to get a political majority behind the strong action that is necessary. And the easiest way to do this is, of course, to tax the rich. It is to ask the rich to pay for the higher well-being of the working majority. In a sane society with educated voters, one should have thought that it would be very simple to pass the bill, to get parliamentary majority in favor of passing the bill to the 10% richest. It proves not to be the case. So this is one of the areas where social science can do a lot. How in the world do you manage to convince ordinary, educated, healthy voters in the West to be in favor of asking the rich to pay for the party? The third thing you need to do is to empower women. And that, luckily, this is one of the things we have learned during the last 50 years, that it does help if you do provide education, health, contraception, and opportunity to women. The fertility rate, the birth rate, the number of children per woman declines like a rock, even in those countries where you wouldn't think that this type of thing happens. So we need more of that, and we need to stop the idiotic idea in the West that you need babies in order to take care of me and the other elderly. I'm 77. I should have been, in a nursing home for the last decade. I'm not going to be there, and I will not be there in another 10 years. Then I will need 2 years of nursing home to die, which most people do. But so this idea of giving birth to people at this point in time who will be finally fed, raised, and educated in 25 years, in order to solve the upcoming problem, is as stupid as only ordinary voters in the rich world can be. Halt biodiversity decline, which means simply to shift from modern industrial agriculture to carbon-positive type of agriculture, called ecologically or regenerative or whatever. It's simply things that ensures that you bind more CO2 in the soil than you emit into the atmosphere. And then finally, what is of course the most urgent thing is to stop climate change. Again, this is easily done. If you stop using coal, oil, and gas, you solve 70% of the problem with one ban. So simply phasing out the use of coal, oil, and gas, 3% per year over the next 30 years, which brings us to 0 in 2050, solves the problem. And we already have the technological solutions. We have sun, we have wind, we have carbon capture and storage, which is actually needed in order for this to happen. And of course, we know energy efficiency. So this is it. This is what we need to do. These are the 5 turnarounds, the 5 extraordinary turnarounds that will be marketed by the Earth for All project. It's basically, doing 5 things and have the rich pay. The basic technologies for doing this already exist, as you can see. It is a mixture of technical know-how and institutional capacity or managerial capacity. It will, of course, help if that technology is improved, and that's, of course, what you're doing in this meeting, which should be lauded, as long as there is a balance between the focus on technical technologies and the social technologies which are needed to get the technical technologies supported. Interestingly, the extra cost of doing this amounts to of the order of 2 to 4% of national global income. So this it isn't cost-free. It is, of course, more costly than doing nothing, but the cost is of the order of 2 to 4%. The cost actually is the cost of taking the workers and the capital, the machinery, that currently produces coal, oil, and gas, heat and power, and shift them into building solar panels, windmills, transmission network for batteries, etc. So it's essentially a shift of 2 to 4% of the labor force from dirty jobs to green jobs. And the reason why there is any cost involved at all, for those of you who know macro economics, it is because the productivity, the labor productivity, is somewhat lower in the green solutions than in the dirty solutions, for the time being, because we haven't evolved these things into scale. And since the cost is only of the order of 2 to 4%, there is no difficulty passing the bill to the rich. The richest 10% of the world population controls 50% of global income. So you basically add a tax of 5 to 10% extra income tax on the world's richest, and that gives you the money necessary in order to pay the workers, to stop working on the dirty stuff and then work on the green stuff. Since this is so simple, what is holding us back? There are 3 reasons why things are not moving like a flow, into sustainability action. First of all, what is needed is not profitable from the investor point of view. You know, most of the things I've spoken about is slightly more expensive than what is going on. And since money flows only into places where there is hope of profit, you know, it does not flow at the high rates into what it ought to do. So the free market will not solve the problem unaided. The second reason is that people fear job loss. You know, so when we are moving the economy from dirty to green, of course, dirty jobs will get lost first before the new jobs arise in the green sector. What to do? It is, of course, to put up an income guarantee for people so that if they lose their job, their income as a consequence of a parliamentary decision, we pay them the salary until they're retrained and have gotten a job in the new sector. If this takes a long time, they should be obliged to work for the common good in non-profitable activity run by the state. In order to do this, you need a stronger state, you need more money, and in order to get more money, higher taxes, a stronger state, you need democratic support. People don't like higher taxes and a strong government, and consequently, very little happens. And it's important to keep this in mind when you're dreaming about the future, that this is where the problem really sits. We know well what needs to be done. It's just that it is not doable in democratic market economies. So, what can technology do? I know finally I have 7 minutes and 26 seconds left, and now I'm going to talk about what. So here are just some slides to show you that the underlying analysis is very complicated. But at least it's watertight. You know, so there are hundreds of variables and there is a lot of thinking, and luckily there is a lot of quantitative support for the conclusions that I've tried to exaggerate. So, what can technology, or how can technology help? And this is my final slide, and so I'm going to use the time to try to go through these things. So technology is helpful in only one way, in the way I see it, and it is to accelerate the change, you know, from the dirty society towards the green society. It is to accelerate the shift that is luckily going on, accelerate the reduction in the footprint so that we can fit, you know, the global world population into below the planetary boundaries. And I've tried to sort the things that can be done. First of all, it is what most of the stands outside here is doing. It is, of course, to improve the cost effectiveness of green solution, you know, to make the clean solution cheaper than the dirty solution in one way or the other, either by lowering the cost of solar panels or lowering the cost of windmills or increasing the efficiency of this thing. Very important and should be pursued, but one must remember that this is not enough. You know, one needs also to work on the economics and on the social and the behavioral side, behavior change. So the second thing is to increase the profitability of green solutions. You know, so there is a difference between the cost and the perceived profitability, and of course, subsidies for green solutions, public investment in green solutions, taxes or bans on fossil solutions. These are important things in order to make capital flows start moving at speed and strength into green solutions. The third thing you need to do, and now we're getting into things that are much more important, really holding us back, this is to reduce the threat from loss of fossil jobs. You know, the reason why the parliament in most educated countries do not pass laws that greatly help the transition to a sustainable world is because the voters are not in favor of this. The voters are in favor of protecting their current jobs. And of course, the capitalists are really interested in maintaining current profits. I'm not so worried about the capitalists, but I am worried about the workers. And as I've said before, the only technique I've developed this far is to provide income guarantees for those who lose their job because of policy decisions. The art then is to get support in the working population for paying people not to do anything, which is difficult, which again can be solved by having these people do something else for the common good while they're receiving this salary. Then fourth, and now we're getting into a really important thing, find ways to pay the extra cost that does not bother the majority of voters. Because if you go to the voter and say that we are a party for increased spending on this, that, and the other, they say this means higher taxes and we won't vote for you. So the simplest solution is, of course, to tax the rich. Tax the 10% richest, which the 90% others should be in favor of. The second solution, which has appeared during the last 2 years, is to pay COVID style, as I call it. This is to pay by the state borrowing money that they do not intend to pay back. So you just, you know, and that is, it has proven fully possible. We did it during the financial crisis 10 years ago, and we did it during COVID, and it works. And the government keeps its reputation, and everyone is happy. And if you wanted, if you dared to challenge, you know, the neoclassical macro mafia that runs our Western world, you know, you would simply start printing money earmarked for green activity. You only need to print 2 to 4% of the money supply every year, and as long as you do not give the money to capitalists, but do give the money to those people that actually work on the ground to create something different, there is absolutely no problem. But of course, and I've forgotten that one sentence, remember that everything I say is hated by the majority of educated people. You know, all the climate scientists disagree with what I'm saying, all the economists disagree with what I'm saying. So please listen to me, and I'm spending time to try to convince you on merits, but don't ask your friend, the neoclassical macro, as to whether limits to growth and Jorgen Randers make sense. They would say clearly no. He's out for lunch. What you need to do, number 5, is to reduce the footprint in the longer run. So that is, I've already spoken about. This is to reduce fertility, particularly in the rich world. Because my daughter, you know, is the most dangerous animal on the surface of the earth. Stinking rich Norwegian. I mean, we are the richest people, the organized society on the surface of the earth. We own between 1% and 2% of all the shares in all the listed companies and all the stock exchanges of all the countries of the world through our collectively owned petroleum fund. She's dangerous. Much, much worse. Luckily, I've only one child. Shorten the work year is one of the, so instead of giving increased wages, give increased vacation time. So in the negotiation in the fall, why 2% more salary? Why not 2% less hours? Same thing from the point of view of the capitalist. And then the final thing, cap material consumption for the rich. That you actually do footprint limitation. You cannot cut income with any effect, but one can say that you're only allowed to use, you know, 3,000 liters of gasoline per year. You know, put in physical limits like that. And then in the end, increase equality and trust, And the reason why you need equality and trust in society is to facilitate agreement on strong collective action. So here there are umpteen things that can be done in order to generate a general idea of collective action. So progressive taxes, inheritance tax, free education and health, guaranteed income for the sick, unemployed and all, universal basic dividend from commons, new special drawing rights for the third. Yeah, it's endless. Of course, all capitalists would look at this and say, this costs too much. This is not according to cost optimization. This is not cost effective using current calculation methods, etc. So they are not particularly enthusiastic about this. So that is it. Technology can help. And both technical technology and social technology. And since we have spent quite a bit of time and effort on the technical technologies, I suggest that we make a slight shift so that more money and competence is kept on the social innovation, institutional innovation, which is necessary to save the world. And I have added, in case someone lists it, here is a number of suggestions about social innovation, and that is it. I wish you the best of luck in trying to save my world.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Randers. Please come and sit next to me.
Yeah.
It is very good to hear this kind of speech from a man in a suit. It's very not common, but very good. Well, first I would like to come back with you on the concept itself of growth. I mean, infinite growth in a finite system, in a human body, we call that a cancer. But in a society, we used to and still call that progress. How did we came up with this idea? And what would be the new narrative you propose to replace capitalism?
It's a good question, and it just proves that in spite of having given this talk 1,000 times, and we haven't been able to communicate the main message. The main message is that on a finite planet, the real problem is the physical footprint. You know, it means that it's the number of people which is the problem, and it is the amount of resources used per person, the amount of pollutants emitted per person, it's the land area used by the person. These are the things that need to be limited, degrown. This needs to be stopped. You know, economic growth, GDP growth, the growth in the value of goods and services can continue to grow forever as long as the footprint stays within planetary boundaries. So I can give very expensive talks and use the money to buy very nice paintings or a wonderful poem from you or care from someone in a nursing home. And you know, we can do this service type of economy. We can expand the GDP without any difficulties. So this thing to try to distinguish between the physical, what we call material expansion in limits, and expansion in value is the important thing. And so the new narrative is one where we talk about footprint growth, you know, instead of economic growth.
Okay, yeah, because one of the main difference between your model in Limits to Grow World 3 and the model used by neoclassical economists as the dice from the Nobel Prize Nordhaus is the fact that they assume that the substitutability of all sorts of capital, so you were talking about the physical footprint, we were very good at converting natural capital to financial capital.
Yeah.
But so this led to think that if we damage the environment by converting natural capital to financial capital with negative externalities, and then we go and build another ecosystem somewhere else to compensate all of this, for them this is okay. Do you agree with that? And at the end we are net positive.
And so you are absolutely right that the debate over the last 50 years has ended up being the discussion as to whether it is possible to have expanding GDP, expanding economic value, without a similarly expanding physical footprint. So this is the decoupling discussion. And most of those academics and scientists that I disagree with use all kinds of arguments to tell that this is impossible. You cannot have an expanding economy without having an expanding footprint. And consequently, they argue that limits to growth, since it says that you cannot have an expanding footprint, it says that you cannot have an expanding economy. And we have disagreed from day one without being listened to. And the simplest example is, of course, in climate, which is actually the planetary boundary that seems to be the tightest. You know, where it is, of course, totally possible, you know, for the world to expand its energy use, which is the physical, and at the same time reducing the footprint, namely the emissions. You know, so you just shift from coal, oil, and gas into sun and wind.
So you're a strong believer in the decoupling?
Absolutely. And what makes me the most angry of all is when I get into the huge scientific community that discusses, you know, strong and weak sustainability and that type of totally theoretical concepts. You know, what we need to do is not to decouple 100.00000%. If we could decouple 50% over the next 30 years, that's more than enough to solve the practical problem. And this is totally feasible if we just accelerated the building of sun and wind. And carbon capture and storage plants, and then we could reduce the footprint while at the same time expanding the energy.
Okay, but what we observe for now is more relative decoupling. What we would need is an absolute decoupling.
Yes. But again, and the reason why I get so angry about this thing, if you try to talk about this in macroeconomic terms, in value terms, it's very difficult to talk about it. And if you say to an ordinary human being that I'm in favor of relative decoupling, not absolute decoupling, you know, the politician and the voter, you know, they don't get the point. So you have to say things like, it is fully possible to increase the energy supply, the number of kilowatt hours of electricity, and the number of calories of heat, easily over the next 30 years, while at the same time reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 30%, 50%.
Okay, thank you. And one last question before we open up to the audience. Now, imagine that I am a young startupper.
Yes.
I think I will change the world with my idea. And I think that all the problem of the world, climate change, biodiversity collapse, the depletion of resources, can be solved with the right technology and the right amount of money. And you have 2 minutes to talk to me. What would you say? What technology, innovation, entrepreneurship cannot solve? And so where are the other competencies and with whom I should team up with?
I think you should spend your time on things that can create a democratic majority for strong action. So you should spend most of your time in the political arena, you know, trying to get things done. So that's my first. So vote correctly is one of the things I'm always saying. That's the first thing you should do, and try to get engaged in political movements that actually understands that voluntary individual action is helpful, but will not solve the problem. You know, you need the strong state in the background. And let me give you one practical example of this, which might interest more of the people here, because it is a little closer to the ground. And check what Philips, the bulb company, did in the late 1970s. They did invent the low watt bulb, The only problem was that it was 10 times as expensive as the ordinary bulb. What did they do? They did something very smart. They went to the EU, to the Commission, and then they said, you know, why don't we make a deal? If you ban the energy-consuming bulb gradually over the next decade, you know, we will produce our efficient bulb, and we will get it into volume so that we can lower the unit cost, so that 10 years into the future, you know, we will have the whole world using our bulbs. They will not be as cheap as the others, but they will be affordable, and they will be bought because you have banned the other stuff. This was a deal that was negotiated. It worked, and we now have the low-watt bulbs.
Okay, but here I hear you talk about efficiency, but then there is also the rebound effect on technology. And for example, I did not hear you on sufficiency, reducing our consumption.
So I call that caps on material consumption.
Okay.
So, because again, the rebound effect, I mean, you should be in my shoes. Go and talk to audiences about rebound effect. You know, it's only the 3 macroeconomists up there and the one there that understands what this means. You know, the fact that if you save money on electricity, you will then buy more electricity, which is wrong. You know, we know that when people have consumed a sufficient amount of food, they don't buy more food when the food gets cheaper. They start buying things. And once they have enough things, they start buying restaurants and hotels and so. So there is a shift also superposed on the rebound effect. So the rebound effect is a very complicated concept which is treated in equilibrium terms by the stupid macroeconomists instead of being treated in a dynamic perspective, which is what you should do.
Okay. Now I would like to open the question to the audience. So please raise your hand if you have a question for Prof. And we already have some.
The guy over
Okay,
there.
just there.
Yeah.
Hello. Thank you for this presentation, highly interesting. I understand on the basis of what you said that transitioning to a lower footprint is not necessarily a technological challenge, even though obviously technology can be improved. I understand that the problem is to finance the transition to those new technologies, what Bill Gates is calling green premiums.
Mm-hmm.
So we don't have a technological problem. We really have an economical problem, and we have a political problem, really, because we need to finance this transition all over the world. One scheme that has been put forward over the past decade is carbon credits in all its shapes and form. And there was a very interesting narrative in Kim Stanley Robinson's The Ministry for the Future, for those of us who have read it, where he imagines a global carbon credit scheme, which really is the vehicle to tax the rich or the polluting economies and to provide pinpoint financing where it is most needed. What is your opinion of such a scheme from a feasibility standpoint? Thank you, Professor.
Wonderful question. And the answer is totally obvious, that if we could have been able to get a carbon price established, it would be a very large step towards a solution, you know, because it would channel more capital into the solutions than current things. We have tried to do so now for 30 years without success. Finally, over the last couple of years, the carbon price in Europe is starting to rise. But of course, what will happen immediately when it gets significant is that there will be a political move in order to reduce its impact. You know, so in other words, yeah, I know that a carbon price would solve the problem. I know also that we haven't been able to introduce it, although this has been the preferred solution for 30 years. And I fear that if it was successful, it would quickly dismantled because it doesn't have the broad support. The alternative solution, the slight institutional improvement on the carbon price, which is that you do tax and then you give the money back to the users, but not according to how much they use, but equal amounts. So you take in a huge amount of money from those that actually use energy, and then you split it by the 8 billion people of the world and hand it back to people. This is what we call the fee and dividend idea of Jim Hansen. That is a way of doing exactly the same thing, which is truly redistributional. You know, it really takes money from the rich and give to the poor, and has the side effect that energy gets more expensive, that carbon gets more expensive. This thing one has tried to introduce in some of the progressive countries of the world, including Norway, which has tried absolutely everything. And once more, it is just like the taxing of the 10% rich. For some reason, you're unable to make the idiots understand that this would actually be to their humongous benefit if we could get a system like this in place. And so we are unable to even get wise recommendation like this approved. You may not be surprised that at my high age, you know, I've finally given up, you know, on trying to save the world. And I've joined the Chinese, because at least they're the party, the 90 million intelligent people who run the country, they at least have the ability to implement in the 20% of the economy in China, which is state-run, you know, the necessary actions in order to build China into a strong power in the future. And we could do the same thing if in our countries we could, in the parliament, elect a senate, a super senate like the Supreme Court, that gets the responsibility to take care of future generation and has the veto right to stop any idiotic decision in the parliament that increases greenhouse gases. You know, something like this could be done as an institutional change in order to try to lengthen the time horizon of democratic market economies. So that's just in order to move from the most crazy idea to support authoritarian government, to try to indicate that institutional change, even in democratic societies, could be made in such a way that we might move more smoothly in the direction of implementing good ideas like the one that you suggested.
And we could continue the discussion forever, but
We
the
could.
time is running, and so now I think I will have time to only one last question, and I will ask you to have a short answer.
Yeah. Sorry.
It's a short question. My name's Sarah Wilkin from Fly Green Alliance. It's kind of a similar question, but what are your thoughts on science-based targets? Because in a way, it's asking corporates, in a way, taxing the rich, the Robin Hood effect. It's looking at their initiatives and their behaviors and getting to a plan and making and essentially paying, maybe through offsets, maybe through other low-carbon solutions, but they are getting to a point where it's integrated into their system. So what are your thoughts on science-based targets?
I am the inventor of science-based targets.
So
I think he liked
I
it.
was a member of the sustainability board of British Telecom from 2000 until 2013, something like this, 13 years. And one of the early things we did was to invent the idea of the science-based targets. And my dear friend Chris Tuppen went on to, you know, live his life according to this. Yes, it helps. You know, it certainly is a good idea. There are many other ideas that are equally good. And all my other comments require much more words. Clearly, this thing has been corrupted by the rich, by the capitalists, you know, the ones that want maximum return on their money. You know, they see to that everything that is agreed, you know, is softened in the corners in such a way that there is no real bite. And they're often supported by workers, because the workers are also worried about shaking the boat, because they know that their job is the one that is first online. So you need more than the science-based targets. But check my wonderful paper in Energy Policy in 2012. I think we wrote a technical summary of this effort.
Well, it is great work. Well done.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Randers. And just before everybody clap, in one sentence, what is your message to the next generation, what they should do?
What I normally say, take a university education, get rich, spend the money to fund your own fight to save the world. Because it will remain difficult to get the funding from someone else. You will never find the job as nice as mine, where you're actually paid to save the world. So you should get your own finance and then start your lonely fight.
Okay, thank you very much.
All right.
And if you had followed my advice, being an unpleasant moderator, you would have said that, but if I follow that advice and I am rich at 45, I will, of course, fall into the trap of all the other rich. Namely that you think that 100 million isn't enough, so you need the 200 million. So that's the thing I'm advising people. Don't make the money, don't get used to using the money. And then at 45, you shift, into saving the world.